Imagine being ridiculed simply for touching a wealthy student's piano, only for the whole room to fall into stunned silence the moment your fingers meet the keys. That was Elijah Brooks. He wasn't talkative, not from shyness, but because empty conversation felt pointless when no one truly paid attention. Home was a cramped, thin-walled apartment on Baton Rouge's west side, near Florida Boulevard, where neighbors were a constant, loud presence. His mother, Charlene, juggled double shifts at a clinic, while his older brother, Isaiah, ran with a crowd Elijah instinctively distrusted. But Elijah? He possessed music. Not a polished instrument or elaborate setup, but an old, battered keyboard at the nearby rec center. Half its keys were unresponsive, its power cord prone to sparking if jostled. Still, for Elijah it was everything. Each afternoon after school he'd hurry there eager to play. No sheet music, no formal lessons, just the melodies and feelings stored in his mind and spirit. He played his truth. Moments of joy, bursts of frustration, stretches of quiet reflection. Some things aren't taught, they simply emerge. At school Elijah kept a low profile. Not a troublemaker but certainly not someone who stood out. Teachers often missed the quiet rhythms he tapped with his pencil during math, or the spark in his eyes during the school anthem. Most peers barely noticed him unless they needed test answers or an easy target for teasing. His one genuine refuge was Miss Delacroix, his music teacher at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle. She was the rare adult who seemed to see past his silence. She'd catch him humming at lunch, beckon him aside after class, and pose questions that made him contemplate chords, scales, how to convey a narrative without speaking. "You perceive the world differently through sound, Elijah," she told him one day after he improvised a lullaby for a pretend assignment. "Never lose that perspective." He had no intention of doing so. Then one Thursday morning before spring break, the school announced a collaboration with Bayside Prep, an elite private academy across town. It was framed as a community arts exchange, meaning Elijah's class would spend a day attending workshops and watching performances at the other school. While most kids groaned, Elijah sat up straighter. Bayside Prep. He'd heard whispers. Sprawling grounds, mandatory uniforms, a cafeteria rumored to serve sushi. Their music department supposedly had a baby grand in every classroom. He couldn't picture it. He'd never touched a real piano. He'd seen one once, gleaming under the stage lights at the downtown concert hall during a class trip to the Philharmonic. A vision from a dream. He spent most of that concert watching the pianist's hands, not listening to the music. Now he had a chance to witness it himself. Maybe even play one if no one was looking. Charlene ironed his best shirt the night before, despite a small cuff stain. "Behave yourself," she instructed, eyes on the board. "Don't embarrass me in front of those people." "I won't." "Don't touch anything you shouldn't." He nodded, meaning it. But music often had a way of making rules fade. Still, Elijah couldn't have predicted how one misstep or perhaps a single act of courage was about to alter everything. The 30-minute bus ride to Bayside Prep felt like crossing into another dimension. As they passed through the iron gates, Elijah gazed out at manicured hedges, functional fountains, buildings resembling museums more than classrooms. Students in matching navy blazers congregated, laughing with the unburdened ease of those without worries for tomorrow. Everything felt excessively clean, almost unnaturally still. Even the walkways seemed costly. Elijah followed his classmates off the bus, backpack strap clutched tight. He said little, absorbing the sight of a courtyard centered around a bronze statue, some founder with a carved smug grin holding a scroll. Inside, the floors gleamed like polished glass, the air scented with lemon and fresh paper. No graffiti, no chipped tiles, no distant shouts from teachers. Just quiet self-assurance. He walked with the group past displays of student art, framed as if destined for a gallery. One piece even had a price tag, $200. Elijah stared. He sketched too, but no one had ever offered to buy his drawings. They were guided into an auditorium where Bayside students were already seated in neat rows. An older man with silver hair delivered a welcome speech in a voice suited for a sermon, speaking of unity and creative expression, calling the event a celebration of diverse talent. Elijah scanned the room. Out of everyone he counted maybe 5 black students. Most Bayside kids looked like they'd never known hunger, never heard "not today," never waited for new socks until Friday. They watched a brief performance by the Bayside Jazz Ensemble, skilled, disciplined, impressive, but with a polished, rehearsed quality that tightened Elijah's chest. Not because he lacked ability, he knew his own skill, but because he sensed no one here would believe it unless he proved it. They split into breakout sessions. Elijah was assigned to a songwriting workshop in room 208. He walked with an unfamiliar group, staying silent while others joked about cafeteria food and parental Teslas. Room 208 was clearly a music room, but unlike his rec center haunt. This one boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, soundproof walls, instruments aligned like sentinels, guitars, violins, a cello tucked away. But his eyes locked onto the piano, a gleaming black Steinway grand, larger than any instrument he'd ever touched. Its lid was up, the keys polished like bone. The instructor hadn't arrived yet, and most students settled into seats without much interest. Elijah didn't. He stood by the wall, his gaze fixed on the piano as if it challenged him. Then a voice from behind cut through, "Don't even consider it." He turned. A tall boy with slicked-back blonde hair was staring, flanked by two others who looked like they practiced scowling. The tall one wore a monogrammed blazer PW stitched on the chest. "That's my dad's contribution," the boy added. "Got anything like that in your neighborhood?" Elijah blinked, unsure if the comment was serious or baiting. "I wasn't planning to damage it." "You sure about that?" The boy smirked. "Be careful. Those keys aren't made for dirty fingers." The words struck like a physical blow. The room grew quiet. Several students turned to watch. Heat rushed to Elijah's ears, but he remained still, hands at his sides. The piano suddenly felt distant, as if it had retreated to another dimension. Part of him wanted to retreat, another part wanted to retort, but he didn't trust his voice to remain steady. Then someone behind the blonde boy snickered. That sound was the catalyst. Something inside Elijah shifted. Elijah didn't consciously decide. One second he was standing, face burning, heart pounding. The next he was walking towards the piano. The smirk on the blonde boy's face faltered. His companions exchanged looks of disbelief. Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled the bench out deliberately and sat down slowly as if time held no meaning. His palms were damp, his throat tight, but his fingers were steady. The room was hushed, not silent but paused like a held breath. The instructor still hadn't entered. A blessing? Fate? Elijah raised his hands above the keys. He paused. This wasn't the broken rec center keyboard. This was authentic. This held weight, producing sound that resonated, filled the space not through loudness but through presence. He felt every eye on him. Preston's voice echoed in his head. Dirty fingers. As if his very touch would stain the air. He took another breath and pressed the first key. Simple C. Soft, clear. It rang out as if it had been waiting. Then came an E, then a G. He built the chord instinctively by feel. No one had taught him how and no one needed to. Music was the only thing that made complete sense without explanation. His left hand followed, laying down bass notes, gentle at first, then stronger. His right hand returned, weaving a melody over the rhythm. Something familiar, unfinished. It was the tune he played when alone, the one he'd never named because it felt too personal. A song that conveyed what words could not. The room transformed. Conversations ceased. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. The two boys behind Preston no longer looked amused. They looked bewildered. Preston said nothing but his jaw tightened. And Elijah? He was no longer aware of them. He wasn't playing for an audience. He was playing for the nights spent in his room, listening to the sounds of his city. He was playing for Sundays, watching his mother sway to gospel, eyes closed, face finally relaxed. He was playing for the part of himself that had never been told, don't touch. The music intensified, his hands moving faster now, confident and sharp. It wasn't flawless, he missed a note, stumbled on a chord. But it didn't matter. It was raw, alive. Playing that demanded no permission. When he finished, the room didn't react immediately. A beat of silence, the kind that follows a sudden impact. Then a girl towards the back exhaled a soft whoa. Another student clapped, then a few more joined in. Preston didn't move, hands clenched at his sides. That wasn't bad, one of his friends muttered, but Elijah heard something else in his tone, grudging respect. The door creaked open. The instructor finally entered, clipboard in hand. She paused mid-step, looking from Elijah to the stunned class. Did I miss something? she asked. A student near the front nodded slowly. Yeah, you did. Elijah rose deliberately, pushing the bench back. He said nothing. He didn't need to. For once, the silence wasn't awkward. It was deserved. But just as he thought the moment was over, he turned and found something unexpected waiting for him in the hallway. Stepping into the hallway, Elijah's chest was still tight with adrenaline, unsure whether to feel pride or apprehension. He hadn't planned to play. He hadn't even been certain he could. But he had, and now everything felt different. That's when he saw the crowd, a small gathering outside the music room. Students from other workshops, a few teachers, all drawn by the sound. Some looked curious, others surprised, a few clearly impressed. But the face Elijah focused on instantly was Miss Delacroix. She stood near the back, hand covering her mouth, not in shock but in something softer, her eyes shining in a way that made him briefly look down. She walked towards him slowly. You really played that? She asked, her voice gentle. He nodded. That music, it was yours? He nodded again, almost afraid to voice it. She looked past him into the room, then back at him. Elijah, that wasn't just good. That was something people will remember. He didn't know how to respond. He hadn't thought about being remembered. He just wanted to touch the keys, to hear how they sounded played without inhibition. Another teacher approached, someone he didn't recognize, a tall woman in a gray blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm. She inclined her head slightly to meet his eye level. I'm Mrs. Coldwell, she introduced herself. I oversee the advanced music program here. I heard you from down the hall. He opened his mouth but no sound emerged. She didn't seem to mind. Have you ever had lessons? He shook his head. Where did you learn to play like that? Just practicing, he said. At the rec center sometimes and at home when my brother lets me use his headphones. She smiled. Well, you possess something extraordinary. That kind of ear, that kind of expression, it's not taught. It's nurtured, guided. Behind her, Preston finally emerged from the classroom, his blazer rumpled. He scanned the crowd, then fixated on Elijah. Their eyes met, but neither spoke. One of Preston's friends whispered something and chuckled, but Preston didn't react. His face was unreadable now, not anger, not arrogance, just uncertainty. Miss Delacroix intervened. Elijah, how would you feel about performing something at the final showcase this afternoon? He looked up sharply. Me? Yes. They always reserve space for a guest student performance at the closing. I believe. No, I know you should do it. He looked at the floor, then at Mrs. Coldwell, then back to Miss Delacroix. A wave of anxiety washed over him. Performing once in a classroom was one thing. Playing in front of the entire auditorium? I don't know, he mumbled. You don't have to, Miss Delacroix said softly, but I think you'd regret it if you didn't. He knew she was right. He nodded slowly. Okay. The teachers began to disperse, the hallway thinning, the moment folding back into the routine of the day. Elijah followed Miss Delacroix as she led him towards the performance hall, his steps hesitant, the hallway stretching seemingly endlessly. But something within him had shifted. It wasn't exactly confidence. It was closer to a quiet certainty, like recognizing the melody of a song you've never heard before. Preston remained behind, alone near the doorway. Elijah, he said quietly. Elijah turned. Preston looked as if he wanted to speak, perhaps to retract his earlier words, or pretend the incident never happened. But instead he offered only the smallest shrug and turned away. But as Elijah entered the auditorium later that day, he had no idea who else might be observing from the shadows, and how deeply his performance would resonate beyond that room. The auditorium felt brighter than he remembered. He stood behind the curtain, heart pounding, staring at the polished stage floor. Rows of seats stretched out, already partially filled. Students drifted in with snacks and programs, chatting and scrolling on their phones. Teachers conversed quietly at the back. Everything seemed relaxed except to Elijah. He wore the same wrinkled shirt from the morning, a damp patch appearing on the collar. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear of playing. He trusted his hands, but from the crowd, the unfamiliar eyes, the weight of being seen. Miss Delacroix appeared beside him, her voice low. They're going to be captivated. What if I make a mistake? He asked. You won't. And even if you do, they'll still feel it. That offered a small measure of comfort. The student announcer, a tall girl with thick glasses and a composed voice, introduced the closing performance. We'd like to welcome a guest student from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Elijah Brooks, performing an original piano piece. Polite applause followed. Elijah walked out, not too quickly, not too slowly, just steadily. The Steinway waited center stage, gleaming under the lights like it recognized him now. He sat, took a single breath, let his fingers find their place and played. This melody was different from the earlier one. Slower, quieter, more contemplative, like a spoken letter. It began with an unnamed ache residing in the pauses between notes, in the way certain chords lingered. Then it transitioned, growing warmer, bolder, like something asserting its own strength. There were embellishments, yes, but nothing ostentatious. Every note served a purpose. The music flowed like thoughts forming mid-sentence. Honest, authentic. Midway through he glanced up. Preston sat 3 rows back, arms folded, watching. They hadn't exchanged words since the hallway, but Elijah didn't need them. The silence between them now wasn't heavy. It was filled with a shared understanding. When the final note faded, Elijah slowly lifted his hands as if releasing something significant. Silence. Then a lone clap. Another. Then the entire room erupted. No standing ovation. This wasn't a movie, but the applause was genuine, robust. Some students stood. One teacher wiped her eye. Even the announcer looked surprised. Elijah stood, bowed instinctively, then quickly exited the stage before the crowd could reach him. In the hallway he leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. That was incredible. He turned. Preston. His blazer was buttoned now, his hair neater, the cockiness gone. He wasn't accompanied by his friends this time. I didn't realize you could do all that, he said. Elijah said nothing. Preston shifted. What I said earlier. I was out of line. Still, Elijah remained silent. I guess I just didn't expect it. Elijah looked at him, then said quietly, You didn't have to. Preston nodded once. Yeah. And that was it. No grand gesture, no handshake. Just an awkward pause between 2 boys in a hallway that suddenly felt too vast for either of them. Miss Delacroix emerged, smiling. You did it. He managed a breathless laugh. I think I did. She looked at him intently for a moment. Let's talk later. There's someone I want you to meet. But what Elijah didn't know was that someone in the audience had already made a crucial call. One that would open a door he'd never imagined walking through. By the time the bus returned to the Martin Luther King Jr. middle parking lot, the sky was painted with gold streaks. Elijah sat near the back, forehead pressed against the window, watching Baton Rouge pass by in fragmented pieces. Fast food signs, gas stations, corner stores, familiar and comforting, yet somehow smaller now. He'd said little on the ride back. Some classmates had given him high fives, a few asked about his playing. One boy, Jamari, had even joked, Bro, you got rich kids to clap? That's magic. Elijah had smiled, but inside, everything still hummed, not with nerves or fear, but something else he couldn't yet name. Miss Delacroix waited at the bottom step as students disembarked. Elijah, she said, gently pulling him aside. That woman I introduced you to, Mrs. Coldwell? She wants to see you again. He blinked. Why? She directs a summer arts program. It's scholarship-based. She said it's unusual to find someone with your natural talent who hasn't had formal training. He looked down at his scuffed sneakers. I don't have money for lessons. That's exactly the point, Miss Delacroix explained. You wouldn't need any. Everything is covered. You just have to attend and play. Elijah was speechless. Opportunities like this didn't find kids like him, not without conditions. I told her I'd speak with your mother, she added. She'll need to know. That night at home, Charlene stood in the kitchen, holding the brochure in one hand and a slightly burnt grilled cheese in the other. Her face was expressionless, but her silence was profound. They're not trying to use him for something? She finally asked. No, ma'am, Miss Delacroix replied from across the table. It's a genuine opportunity. They've done this for students all over the state. Charlene scanned the paper again. And he'd stay where? In supervised dorms at the Baton Rouge School for the Arts. Just a few weeks. He'll be home before summer ends. Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, backpack still on, fingers curled around the straps. His mother stared at him, unblinking. You want this? He met her gaze. I think so. She sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that meant her mind was far ahead of her words. "He's 12, she said softly. "Still a baby." "I'll be careful," Elijah whispered. "You better be," she replied, looking back at Miss Delacroix. "I'll consider it." For now that was more than enough. A week later the letter arrived. A white envelope with blue trim, his name neatly typed. Inside was the formal acceptance. Elijah read it 3 times before handing it to his mother. She didn't speak at first, just nodded, then handed it back in silence. He packed his belongings into an oversized duffel bag. Miss Delacroix drove him to the campus herself. On the way, she shared stories of other students who had attended the program. Some who had never touched a real instrument until their first lesson. Others who had gone on to prestigious schools like Juilliard and Berkeley. "But none of them sounded like you," she said, and he knew she meant it. The campus wasn't like Bayside. It lacked the polish, the obvious expense. But it felt authentic. The music building had chipped paint on the windowsills and benches worn smooth from years of waiting students. He liked that. On his first day he played for 3 instructors. They didn't ask where he came from. They asked what key felt most like home. He said D minor. They nodded as if they understood. By the end of the first week he had composed 3 new pieces. By the end of the second he was showing a classmate how to navigate chord changes with feeling, not just calculation. One evening after dinner his instructor sat beside him in the practice room. "You know what I told my husband after I heard you play?" she said. Elijah shook his head. "That's what talent looks like when it's fearless." But even with new keys beneath his fingers and doors opening, Elijah still had one more thing he needed to do before any of it felt truly real. It was October when Elijah returned through the doors of Bayside Prep. This time he didn't arrive on a school bus, no matching t-shirt, no field trip form. He came alone, invited back by Mrs. Coldwell to perform at the annual fall recital. It was her idea. A surprise solo by a student from the summer arts program, a demonstration of what raw talent could achieve with the right guidance. Elijah had grown slightly since spring. His jeans fit better, his curls were tidier, and his hands held a quiet assurance. He still wasn't overly talkative, but when he spoke, people listened. The auditorium was just as he remembered, gleaming floors. Bright lights, that stage. It no longer felt larger than him. In the front row sat Miss Delacroix, purse in her lap, eyes shining with quiet pride. Beside her, Charlene, wearing her best blouse, gripping the edge of her seat as if it were her only anchor. She'd been hesitant about the performance initially. "I don't understand what people like that expect from kids like us," she'd said. Elijah had answered simply, "Just to listen." Now here she was waiting to hear. The MC gave a brief introduction. "Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us why music remains essential. Please welcome Elijah Brooks." He walked out, not too fast, not too slow, just steady. The Steinway was there again, waiting. This time he didn't pause. The piece he played was new, composed 2 weeks earlier, inspired by his summer. It had no title, just motion. It began low, steady, like measured footsteps, then ascended bar by bar into something warmer, more certain. There were flourishes, yes, but nothing flashy. Everything was deliberate. Notes flowed like thoughts forming spontaneously, honest, true. Halfway through he glanced up. Preston sat 3 rows back, arms folded, watching. They hadn't exchanged words since the hallway, but Elijah didn't require them. The silence between them now wasn't heavy. It was imbued with understanding. When the final note lingered in the air, Elijah held it, just long enough for the collective breath in the room to catch. Then he lifted his hands. And this time the applause arrived swiftly, not polite, not hesitant, but genuine. Charlene stood. She didn't clap immediately. She just gazed at her son as if she couldn't believe he was hers. Then quietly she smiled. After the performance, people approached him, teachers, parents, a few students. They inquired about his music, his learning process, his future plans. He answered as best he could, still unaccustomed to so much attention. But one moment resonated most. A small boy, perhaps 9, thin, with crooked glasses, walked up and whispered, "That made me want to try piano too." Elijah knelt slightly. "You should." "I don't know how." "Doesn't matter. Just begin." The boy smiled. That was enough. Later, as they drove home, Charlene was quiet. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked. She nodded. "I just never thought I'd witness something like that. Not with your name attached to it. He looked out the window as the street lights blurred past. Me neither, he said. But maybe it was always there. She didn't reply, but her hand reached across the console and rested on his. That night, Elijah sat at home with a notebook in his lap. He wasn't composing music, just writing words, scattered thoughts, a line he wanted to remember. You don't need permission to be allowed. The world hadn't granted him the right to sit at that piano. He had claimed it, gently, honestly, completely. And in doing so he had reminded them and himself that talent doesn't care about origins, attire, or parental contributions. It only asks that you listen when it calls. So, if you're watching this and questioning whether you're good enough, whether you're entitled to try, consider this your affirmation. You are. Now go create.